Hey there, welcome to Why Aren't You, the show where we can pick up our black eyeliner and I Heart Booby bracelets and listen to one of the generation-defining bands of the 2000s, My Chemical Romance. That's right, one of the darkest, angstiest bands of all time. I'm gonna whine about their single greatest accomplishment, the album that kickstarted a new love and appreciation for rock operas. And what's that? We're not we're not talking about the Black Parade? Oh, then we must be talking about the album before that, Three Cheers for Sweet Revenge. This one isn't as important to my growing up as The Black Parade was, but it still had some bangers. I'm Not Okay is obviously one of the most recognizable emo songs of its generation. This is a little bit less of a concept album, but it's still pretty... Hold on. We're not talking about Three Cheers either? Don't tell me we're talking about I Brought You My Bullets. Well, if it's not that one either, then what are we talking about for My Chem?
Listen up! The future is bulletproof. The aftermath is secondary. It's time to do it now and do it loud. Killjoys, make some noise.
Now, I'm not going to disrespect anyone here and say that people hated Danger Days, The True Lives of the Fabulous Killjoys, because there are many people that absolutely love this album, myself included. I'm not going to lower the standards and say it's the black sheep of the MCR discography because it's so pop-oriented compared to the band's other releases. But what I am going to say is that Danger Days would be probably one of the most recognized albums of the 2010s if it had just released a few years later than it did. I'm going to apologize in advance because this is probably going to be much more disjointed compared to my other Why Aren't You videos, but that's because this is a bit more of a frantic rant than what I'm used to. Normally this is where I would go into the history of the album and talk about the story and the concept album, but instead it's going to be more like a research essay on the popularity of Danger Days. Let's start with the first point, that this album was released a bit too early to be as recognized as it could have been. It received so much positive press, with a 70% on Metacritic, 4 stars from Alternative Press, and 3.5 stars from Rolling Stone. Dan Martin from NME even stated that this was the best rock record of 2010 by such a large margin that you actually feel embarrassed for everyone else. This is all fine and dandy, and looking at some of the records that were released in 2010, I can buy that sentiment. There were some pretty good albums released in 2010 from some of my favorite bands at the time, including A Day to Remember, The Wonder Years, and The Black Keys being some of them. What I think made them great to me was that they were all very samey. Like, they were pretty much writing new songs using the same style of music that had made them popular in the first place. There's one album that was released by a rock band that doesn't really follow this, but I'm going to talk about that one later. And repetition is fine. Repetition is fine. Repetition is fine. There's nothing wrong with that, and at the time, I really love that that's what they did. But what I can't help to notice is that I don't regularly go back to any of these albums a decade later. Compared to Danger Days, which I try to listen to every few months. That's kind of the tune with a lot of other rock albums that came out in 2010 as well. Most rock bands at the time were sticking to the formula. A Day to Remember made more post-hardcore music. The Wonder Years did more pop-punk. Escape the Fate and Sleeping with Sirens did more screamo, all things that were expected from these bands. What made Danger Days different was that it was different. The past 3 albums from the band were all emo anthems, with elements of screamo, pop-punk, and rock. These were all dark and dreary and depressing, ranging with themes of cynicism about relationships formed as young adults, to The Black Parade being an entire album dedicated to the theme of loss in the afterlife. Album art and promotional materials for these albums were colorless, gothic, horror-inspired aesthetic that the band became known for. Danger Days pulled a Yui in the complete opposite direction with its visuals. The album artwork is in full color and full of life. The music is a lot happier sounding due to its bright synths and guitar solos, feeling like they took a more pop-oriented approach. The music videos even feature colorful characters and costumes, but all at the same time, those rock, punk, and emo influences still stay intact to deliver a sound that would be familiar enough to fans of My Chemical Romance, but still code it in a way that could convince new fans to join the ranks via radio releases. The difference brought me to this album even back when it came out. I was only 13 at the time, so I couldn't really understand why it was so interesting to me. It just felt like it's different and that's cool. It had that Jenny Sequoia I keep hearing about. And that leads me to the conclusion as to why this album was great when it came out. It was just different enough to keep me interested, and it was even a nice bit of pop for the radio waves at the time. Compared to most of the other bands that I listened to, this was a band that I could hear on the radio, or have one of the music videos show up on MTV in the morning before school. Good luck getting a 4-year strong music video on MTV in the 2010s. They'd have to compete with the likes of Eminem and Lady Antebellum. But let's talk about my claim that this would have been a much more beloved album if it had released a few years later. First off, I think it's important to note that no matter what kind of music is released, My Chemical Romance will always be shadowed by the legacy they created with The Black Parade. This album could have single-handedly defined a whole generation if it weren't for some of the supporting acts that followed in their whiny footsteps. With The Black Parade only releasing 4 years before Danger Days, the generation of emo kids was still riding this all-black aesthetic a bit too hard. From my memory, there were still goths at my school until like 2012 that swore by this album as the only thing that would ever understand them. If they're still doing that 6 years post-release, there'd be no way they'd open up to a new album from their favorite band that completely ignored these old ways. In any other case, 4 years is plenty of time to look at where you were, think a little bit about the trials and tribulations you went through, and decided that maybe it's time for a change. But for My Chemical Romance fans at the time, I think they were afraid of change and just wanted to keep to their little fishnet-sized hidey holes. But even excluding the shadow of influence that The Black Parade had on the community of teenagers who liked guitar but hated their dad's music, 2010 was just not the vibe for pop-inspired rock music in the zeitgeist of the average Joe. Like I said earlier, people were just stuck to their old ways, listening to what they liked and nothing else. However, around the second half of the 2010s, this is where we got the beginning of the pop rock explosion. Pop rock icons like the 1975 had released their self-titled debut album, integrating catchy choruses and a more radio-friendly vibe. Fall Out Boy had come out of their hiatus and released Save Rock and Roll, an album with increased electronics and a more pop-influenced sound. Even Paramore was going more pop with their single Still Into You, where it hit 24th on Billboard's Top 100 in December of 2013. Other bands in the scene were all trying to catch up and try to go a bit more radio-friendly, which is kind of interesting considering the scene a few years later. And I can't officially say that My Chemical Romance was the only band trying to go pop in 2010. Remember that album I teased earlier? The only other album I can argue that went on a more of a pop influence was Inner Speaker, the debut album of psychedelic fuckboy band of the decade, Tame Impala. Tame Impala is one of those bands that has slowly influenced a majority of dudes in their 20s that claim that they love obscure indie music, but all flock to the same 4 or 5 artists. I doubt that My Chemical Romance was one of the defining influences of Tame Impala's first album, but it's just kind of funny to think that they released the same year. But what I can say is that some of my favorite bands of the past few years probably can list My Chemical Romance as an influence, or at least as a band that they enjoyed growing up. Some of the big ones I can think of are CRX, Hippocampus, Remo Drive, and the 1975. Even though some of these bands have a 7-year difference between their releases and Danger Days, I feel like they all have a very similar vibe to them. Like, you could put Danger Days on a playlist with these kinds of bands, and it would all sound very similar and have a very similar vibe, despite Danger Days coming out 5 years plus before it. Danger Days is one of those albums that I think will always be one that defined a generation. But, like Marty McFly said,
I guess you guys aren't ready for that yet. But your kids are gonna love it.
Alright, now for the Why Aren't Yous, where I try to figure out why on earth you haven't listened to Danger Days yet. Or maybe this will convince you to give it a re-listen. This is of course considering that you've listened to The Black Parade already in full. Which, if you haven't done that yet, what the hell are you still doing here? Black Parade is one of the most important rock albums of the 2000s. You need to pause this video right now and do that. We can wait. Are you back yet? Alright, let's get into it. Did I hear you say this was a concept album? Yes it is. Much like its predecessor, Danger Days tells a story with lyrics and song choices. According to Wikipedia, the story is based around the fictional lives of the Killjoys, a group of rebellious rogues living in a post-apocalyptic California in the year 2019. Which, the post-apocalypse only being about a year behind the current hellscape that we're living in is fucking terrifying. Is it really a My Chemical Romance album if it isn't about being sad? I think it's important to understand that bands shouldn't have to pigeonhole themselves into one specific kind of music. Some of the best albums are the ones where the band experiments and tries to do something different, because it then shows that there's a variety in what a band is able to create. Plus, this album can still get kind of sad. Throughout the video, you can't stop talking about the Black Parade. If this album is good on its own, why keep comparing it to its predecessor? That's actually a really good question. Though I think this album is great on its own, even I can't escape the influence that the Black Parade had on my growing up. It was one of those albums I listened to with my friends when we bonded over it. Obviously, this wasn't when it came out because I was like 9 and I didn't have a personality yet, but by the time I was in middle school, My Chemical Romance was a big deal to me. Black Parade was one of the coolest albums I'd heard, and I'd styled most of my other music I listened to based on that, listening to the darker, sad music that was popular at the time. When I discovered Danger Days, this was like a stepping stone for me to listen to other kinds of music, more happy and more pop-oriented stuff. There is no Danger Days without the Black Parade, so you can't have one without having the influence of another. Danger Days, The True Lives of the Fabulous Killjoys, is available on Spotify and Apple Music. I'm sure you can find a CD of it at your local record store. You can also probably find the music videos here on YouTube, but I've gone into a lot for this video and have nothing left to give. I have a few videos in the works right now that are kind of breaking the why aren't you format, so I might try to sprinkle those out over the next few weeks to keep from sticking to one format. But anyways, I thank you for sticking around to the end if you've done so, and I'll catch you guys on the next video.